All right, let's talk about the 150% group project. Today we're going to unpack something called egocentric bias. And trust me, it's this little mental shortcut that secretly shapes pretty much every single collaboration you've ever been a part of.
So let me ask you something. Think back to the last time you were in a group project. Did you have that nagging feeling that you were doing most of the heavy lifting? You were putting in the late nights, doing that little bit of extra research, and you just knew you were pulling more than your fair share. It's a pretty familiar feeling, isn't it?
Well, here's the crazy part. While you were feeling like the unsung hero of the whole thing, guess what? Every single one of your teammates was probably feeling the exact same way about their own work.
And this isn't just a hunch. When researchers actually ask group members to estimate what percentage of the work they did, the total almost always adds up to well over 100%, which is, mathematically impossible. And that little impossibility is the perfect window into a really powerful cognitive bias that we're about to put a name to.
Okay, so let's get into it. What exactly is egocentric bias? This is the technical term for that I did everything feeling we all know so well. At its heart, egocentric bias is basically our brain's default setting. It's this natural tendency to lean way too heavily on our own personal perspective. Now, it's super important to understand this is not a character flaw. It's not about being arrogant or selfish. It's more like a glitch in our mental software, a cognitive shortcut that just makes us overestimate our own role in things.
And hey, this idea has been around for a while. The bias was first identified in a paper way back in 1979 by Michael Ross and Fiore Sickley. But it was a psychologist named Anthony Greenwald who gave it the official name, egocentric bias, just 1 year later, in 1908.
Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't this just self-serving bias? And that's a great question. They're kind of like close cousins, but they are different. Egocentric bias is all about perspective. You overvalue your input because it's the experience you know best. Self-serving bias, on the other hand, is more about ego. That's when you take credit for all the wins and blame others for all the losses. It's a subtle difference, but a really important one.
So how do we actually know this is a real thing? Let's take a look inside some of the fascinating experiments that reveal this inner spotlight we all seem to have.
It turns out this bias shows up incredibly early in life. In this classic study, a child and a stuffed animal both watch an object it put into box A. Then, the stuffed animal gets taken out of the room. While it's gone, the experimenter moves the object to box B, with the child watching the whole time. Then, they ask the kid, where will the stuffed animal look for the object? And almost every time, the child points to box B. They just can't separate their own knowledge from the animal's perspective. That's egocentric bias in its purest form.
And it definitely continues into adulthood. A 1993 study in Japan uncovered something really cool. When they asked people to write about fair behaviors they'd experienced, they noticed that the sentences overwhelmingly started with one word, I.
And the flip side, well, when they asked people to write about unfair behaviors, the sentences consistently started with the word others. It's like we instinctively link good actions with ourselves and bad actions with everyone else. Our own language gives the game away.
This bias can even warp our very sense of fairness. One study found that people felt it was significantly more fair for them to be overpaid for a task than for someone else to be overpaid. It just goes to show you that fairness isn't some fixed, objective standard. It tends to bend toward our own self-interest.
So the big question is, why? Why do our brains even do this? Let's unpack the programming that's running in the background.
It really seems to boil down to three key things. First, there's the self-reference effect. We're just wired to remember information better when it relates directly to us. Second, something called active encoding. It makes sense, right? We have much clearer, more vivid memories of things we actually did compared to things we just watched. And finally, it might just be an old evolutionary habit. In small, ancient tribes, assuming everyone saw things your way was probably a pretty efficient mental shortcut.
Okay, so that's the science. But what about the bias in real life? Because this isn't just a quirky lab finding. This personal bias has some major ripple effects.
And this brings us right back to our group project. Every single person on the team clearly remembers their 35% contribution, but everyone else's work is just a little bit fuzzy. Now, nobody's lying, they're all just remembering their own part best, which leads to this collective overclaiming that adds up to an impossible 140%.
And this bias pops up absolutely everywhere. In relationships,
Studies have found that spouses each tend to overestimate their share of the household chores and also their share of starting arguments. It can affect mental health too. Anxiety, for example, is often linked to exaggerating our role in events. Interestingly, people with depression are sometimes more realistic about their contributions. It even influences politics, making us believe our preferred candidate is way more likely to win or that our single vote is more significant than it really is.
So are we just doomed to be stuck in our own heads? Not at all. In fact, that same study on fairness found a surprisingly simple solution. When a mirror was placed in front of the participants, just forcing them into a moment of self-awareness, the bias vanished. Just like that. Suddenly, they rated fairness equally for themselves and for others.
The takeaway here is pretty powerful. It seems that just the act of consciously stepping back, of forcing yourself to consider other perspectives, can help correct for this really deep-seated bias. And it leaves us with a critical question to ask ourselves. In our own lives, where is our personal spotlight shining brightest? And what might we be missing in the shadows?